we're going to be talking about domestic violence, and we're going to be talking about how you, as people who support those in housing, can do your best to really make it a less traumatic experience. I'm Nick Beard. I'm the policy coordinator at the Delaware Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So I'm kind of our point person on housing. And Tony, I'll let you introduce yourself as well.
Great, thanks, Nick. My name is Tony Szerzega. I'm a staff attorney at Community Legal Aid Society with our eviction defense program and our fair housing program as well. Really excited, definitely seeing some familiar faces here, and really excited to get through this presentation.
Great. Well, welcome again, everyone. So just to do a couple housekeeping items. All right, audience lines are going to be muted. So if you have a burning thought and I'm in the middle of a sentence, what should you do? The chat box is open, so feel free to put it in the chat. I'm always eager to hear questions, things that you think are confusing or you want me to repeat. Please feel free to just put in the chat any questions and we will get to it for sure. There's going to be an evaluation after the session. That is for me for feedback about how we did. Tony, of course, I'm sure is practically perfect in every way and needs no evaluation. I, on the other hand, do, and we can send you a certificate of attendance if you complete it. Also, I'm going to note to take care of yourself. We're going to be talking about some heavy topics here, about domestic violence, about trauma. You might need a minute. You might need to turn your camera off, to take a breath, to walk away for a minute, grab a glass of water, grab coffee. Totally fine. Make sure you're looking after yourself. And I'll note that this session is being recorded. So most importantly is that if you have anything you want to ask a question about that is specific, let's be thoughtful about identifying details and about making sure that we are asking questions in a way that isn't violating anyone's privacy or confidentiality. Okay, so
hey Nick, really quickly, if you want to change the display settings, because we are seeing the next slide after the current slide. Yep.
All right. Let's try again. All right, what do you see now?
So I don't see anything.
All right, let's try again. Thanks for your patience, everyone. It's a total Monday, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. So if you see this display settings tab at the top?
Yes, it's hidden under my taskbar. So let me move my taskbar.
Okay, and you want to, yep, there we go. Yep,
that does it. Perfect.
Yes.
All right. Thanks for your patience, everyone. So no spoilers. You're going to not see the next tab till I get there. All right. So jumping right in, what is domestic violence? Does anyone want to put their thoughts in the chat? All right. So the reason that this is a little bit of a confusing one is because it's defined differently depending on the context. So in Delaware, we define it as any crime between people who fall into the definition of family. That I think is important to be aware of as housing providers. There's the Tolstoy quote, of course, about how all happy families are all alike, but all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. And so working in domestic violence, you see an incredible range of interfamily dynamics. Everything from between parents and children, between siblings, and between intimate partners. We have only a few hours today, so we can't possibly revisit all of those dynamics, but I do want to remind you that in Delaware, in family court, domestic violence really is defined broadly between the family. So it's something to be aware of, even if it's not what we're going to go into in detail today. We're really going to go in detail today about intimate partner violence. And so that means domestic violence is an intentional pattern of coercive control used by one partner over the other in an intimate relationship. So that is very specific. That is between one intimate partner and another intimate partner, and it is about this idea of power and control. So what is coercive control? Because we're going to go back to this phrase quite often in domestic violence. It is a pervasive, methodical pattern of abusive behavior in a relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain power and control over another intimate partner. And that manifests in a lot of ways. It can be physical, sexual, emotional, or psychological actions or threats of actions that influence another person. So this is particularly topical because the most recent reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act has really broadened the look at what this coercive control and behavior is, and really specifically mentions coercive control. So it's really about that pattern of behavior rather than the behaviors itself. In Delaware, in the criminal code, we talk a lot about specific physical actions that are crimes, but it's really important to recognize that it happens in this framework of coercive control and power and control. So what are the health and safety implications for survivors of domestic violence? There are a lot of different effects this can have. Obviously, concern for ongoing safety. For a domestic violence survivor, just because they are not at the moment being threatened with imminent physical harm doesn't mean that they are currently safe. There's PTSD symptoms. The kind of trauma that happens to a domestic violence survivor is something that has long-term psychological impact. Lasting physical injuries. We know that individuals who have experienced domestic violence are more likely to have lasting physical injuries, as well as chronic health conditions. The ACEs study that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, which looks at adverse childhood experience, has recognized that children who witness domestic violence are at a greater risk of health issues later in life as a result of that traumatic stress. So not only if you experience it, but also if you grow up in a family where domestic violence occurs. And then finally, we're going to talk a lot about trauma in this presentation, so that's certainly something that we are going to come back to. So what does domestic violence look like in a housing context? Tony, I know you have some examples that you've seen with clients, but these can often be phone calls to the police, keeping a partner off the lease, unwanted, unannounced visits to the home. Tony, did you want to say a little bit about what you've seen with clients?
Yeah. I mean, I think what I would add is, thinking about the idea of coercion and coercive control, and what the Violence Against Women Act and what the Fair Housing Act have identified is, one area where, some of the most powerful, ways that a partner or, an abuser can control their partner, control a survivor is through access to their housing, and access to, safe shelter and the roof over their head. So when we, think of, any form of economic control that an abuser can, use and hold over a survivor, we're talking about things like, see on this list, keeping a partner off of a lease, or if they're the, if the abuser is the one who is in control of bank accounts or credit cards, they're, it's the partner or the survivor is relying on, their abuser to pay the rent. So we're, there's at the biggest, or at the most important or the highest end of the control, there you're looking at, literally being responsible for paying the rent, or, being responsible for the person, for the survivor to be able to stay, in a unit. And then also, we go down the line of, we, deal with a lot of, we'll have a lot of clients come to CLASI where their, landlord is threatening them because the police are coming out to the property frequently, or their abusive partner keeps showing up at the property and causing, fights or fighting with other tenants or other issues like that. So we really can, see the wide spectrum of, really, being in control and controlling a survivor's, shelter and where they're living to, other instances of that are, that can be more of an issue to, someone's immediate safety or health or, interactions with police.
Yeah, so it's something that can be very present in the lives of survivors, and housing can very much be a tool of that control. So thank you, Tony. So the other issue I really wanted to flag is stalking, because even if you might not live with your partner, stalking can be something that is very, very relevant in a housing context. Often the one place where you can reliably be several times in the evening is your home. So it's really important that we look at stalking and be aware of stalking in the housing context. So there are two different definitions of stalking, and you might notice we said this with domestic violence as well, that there is the behavior and the criminal statute, because the reality is not all of these behaviors are criminal, but it is important that we are aware of the behavioral context of stalking. So stalking is a course of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to fear for their safety or the safety of others, or suffer substantial emotional distress. And that can be a lot of leeway there. What is a reasonable person? Is a reasonable person someone who had childhood trauma? Is a reasonable person someone who had extreme stalking situations before? All of this can be hard to figure out in a criminal context, but it's worth us noting that it is really, really about the course of conduct and about the context. So what kind of behaviors could be considered stalking? Looking at someone's social media 10 times a day, not just teenagers with their ex-boyfriends, texting someone 100 times over the day, showing up repeatedly in the same place as someone, repeatedly posting on someone's social networking site, all of the above. And remember, now these days with social media, it's unfortunately even easier to stalk someone than it used to be. And I think it's really important to mention that this is about context. What happens makes sense in a context. If I said to you that someone sent me some flowers, well, that seems like a nice thing. If I told you that the context of those flowers was someone who kept showing up at my house every single day, that would kind of change the context of it, wouldn't it? So with context, something might be frightening for the victim, but not for you. And stalking behaviors often have very specific meanings. So it can be leaving someone a specific tape, all these kind of things that they are aware of that you are not, just to be conscientious that just because to you, the housing provider, it sounds like not a big deal, doesn't mean that it's not to the victim without the history. So recognizing that there can sometimes be a lot of context and history that you're not aware of. So under Delaware law with stalking, you can see that this is very much around the reasonable person. And we've definitely had some issues with what is a reasonable person. Your guess is as good as mine sometimes. Fear the physical injury, and suffer other significant mental anguish or distress. What is significant? What is regular mental anguish or distress? That's the fun thing we get to figure out in court. That may, but doesn't necessarily require medical or professional treatment or counseling. So just to recognize that it's very important when you're speaking to someone that you are listening, that you are understanding, and recognizing that one incident isn't necessarily the entirety of it. And so we're going back to trauma, because this is the effect that all these behaviors can have. So I am really curious to hear in the chat, what is one word you think of when you hear the word trauma? Felicia, do we have anything in the chat?
Yes, we do. So it looks like a few words: abuse, pain, buzzword, fear, stressful event, damage, abuse, fear, horrible, scared, PTSD, a traumatic experience, wounded, common, hope.
These are
And
great. So it's great to get a sense that this is something that can affect everyone in some way or another, for sure. Because we know that trauma is unique and individual, and it can impact our perceptions, both of activities that we're experiencing and activities that other people are experiencing. So as an individual, trauma is about incorporating what happened to someone with their individual response. And we understand a lot more that the same people can experience one event very, very different ways. We also recognize that everyone has a different reaction to it. So we tend to consider trauma the experience of an event or a condition in which you either experience, witness, or hear about some kind of threat, and leads to feelings of fear, which is something people highlighted a lot, which is great, helplessness, or horror. For children, it can also include a threat to their parent or primary caregiver. That's why a child witnessing domestic violence can be very traumatic, even if the child isn't threatened themselves. And one thing that we have to talk about when we discuss trauma is the individual's coping capability, and that there is a different sense of being able to deal with your emotional experience and your ability to cope and be resilient. I think it's also essential to mention that culture can really influence the type of traumas you experience, how it's handled. Are you in a community that really urges you to seek support and overcome resiliency, or a family that really ignores that trauma and forces you to repress it and not deal with it? It's really important to look at your culture both in a small scale within your own home to the broader scale. I don't know about any of you, but I find that there's a lot more understanding of the need for mindfulness and mental health support in schools than there was when I was a student 20 years ago. So all of those things influence our culture and help us deal with trauma. There's going to be very many different definitions, but what's really important for us in this conversation is that how people experience trauma is incredibly unique. And for a lot of survivors, attitudes which might seem unhelpful or seem frustrating to us are coping strategies that they needed to survive. One of the key effects of trauma is that we can't really regulate our stress response. So things that feel like a small deal can feel like a really big deal to a survivor. I would say specific things that we now recognize do cause trauma are abuse, which someone else flagged, abandonment, neglect, death or loss of a loved one, life-threatening illness of you or a loved one, witnessing domestic violence, automobile accidents, other serious accidents, life-threatening health situation, and witnessing or experiencing community violence. That's a lot of different things that a lot of people in our community experience regularly, unfortunately. So it's really important that we note that it's perceived as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and recognize that sometimes what we perceive as adults is not what children perceive. So again, recognize that this is through their perspective. It overwhelms our ability to cope. So it is one thing to sit there and say to yourself rationally, this is not a big deal. This is something I can handle. But to a survivor who doesn't have that regulated stress system, something that feels like a small deal can really be a big deal and be something that's really hard to cope with and handle. Have you ever had the circumstance where you're already stressed out about something else and something small becomes the end of the world? I remember when I was sitting exams, and if they were sold out of my favorite kind of hummus, it felt like the end of the world, not because of the hummus itself, but because I was just already in such a stress situation. Think about that with survivors, where the small thing really becomes the straw that broke the camel's back due to their emotional state. And also, it's important to remember that there's lasting physical or emotional effects. Just because someone is not actively in the traumatic experience doesn't mean that they're not dealing with the physical and emotional aftermath. So remember that even being removed from it isn't at the place where they're necessarily healing. It's important to remember that trauma is both an event and a response to an event. So it's a little bit of a cycle, which makes it kind of hard to break. You're dealing with the trauma in the moment, and then you're dealing with your response. Yeah, I know, it's a tough one. So where does trauma come from? We touched on this a little bit. One big source of trauma, adverse childhood experiences. I don't know how many of you are very familiar with the ACEs study, but it's something that we think about time and time again, that the more adverse childhood experiences you have, the more difficult it is for you to cope and deal with trauma. And it's a recognition that it's something that is very, very cumulative over time. One adverse childhood experience isn't going to affect, well, it can, but is less likely to affect an overwhelmingly child with a supportive environment, with great coping skills, with resiliency. But as these things add up, it becomes more and more difficult to overcome the source of trauma. So adverse childhood experience study was one of the largest studies ever conducted on the association between what you experience in your childhood and your health and well-being later in life. So this was done by the Centers for Disease Control and the Kaiser Clinic, so some big hitters. And what happened was it did a comprehensive physical evaluation of over 17,000 adults who were asked to provide detailed information about their childhood experiences of abuse, neglect, issues in their family. So the experiences that were considered an adverse childhood experience were recurring physical abuse, that's ongoing, recurring emotional abuse, sexual abuse, any individual with substance or alcohol use, an individual who has been incarcerated, any individual with mental health issues, a mother who was treated violently, growing up without a parent, or emotional and physical neglect. And the reason this is so important is that it helps us move our perspective from what is wrong with you to what happened to you, recognizing that a lot of this behavior, unfortunately, has its experience in childhood. So I love this tree because it shows us the roots. So it shows that all of this is intertwined. So adverse childhood experiences, dealing with a family member who might not have been able to care for you due to mental health, due to abuse, but all the things that are happening at the community level as well. And if you'll notice, one of them is poor housing. Having a quality housing can make such a difference to how you experience your childhood, which is an amazing responsibility because you can really make a difference. So I think it's important to recognize that having this multi-abuse trauma, where you're experiencing all these different things, really does continue to add up. So if you're dealing with childhood trauma and poverty and homelessness and disability or mental illness, it all adds together. And we recognize again, I know I keep coming back to this, but I really want to make sure I reiterate it. The trauma means that your coping skills are not as good as they could be. The things that feel small to you are a big deal to a survivor. Now, and as a field, we understand a lot more about what's happening in your brain than we used to. So when we look at pieces of our brain, and I am not a neuroscientist, the last science class I took was in Tatnall High School, so forgive me if I totally get this wrong. But my understanding is that the amygdala is your doing brain, and that is the bit that responds to threats, to danger, and to intense emotion. And it's kind of designed as a smoke alarm. So your brain hears, I'm in danger, and starts to ring so that you know that something is wrong. The problem is that it's responsible to help you look after yourself and recognize danger. But if you're not able to recognize danger well, if your brain is constantly telling you you're under a threat, then everything is perceived through that lens. And that can be really scary. That makes everything, no matter how small, feel like a threat. So this is a different part of your brain. Sorry, I'm just going to take a drink. And this is a different place for your amygdala. So this is the part of your brain that helps you plan, helps you problem solve, and help you organize the world around us. This is the part of brain that you're doing when you're analyzing situations rationally, making thoughtful decisions, deciding whether or not to do a training today or to stay in bed all day. That's the part of your brain that says, you know what, Nick, you should probably go to work instead of staying under the covers on an icky morning like today. But the reality is that when the doing brain is saying that there's danger, the thinking brain is supposed to then back up. The doing brain tells thinking brain, I've got this, something's going wrong. And the thinking brain says, I guess it isn't for me. The doing brain is the one that takes over. So the problem is the doing brain then tells the thinking brain things aren't okay. But the thinking brain is trying to say everything's fine. So what we need to work on with trauma is to support people in recognizing those responses and better balancing their thinking and doing brain. So knowing everything's okay, I understand this reaction, and then the doing brain can relax. So it's a little bit of a balance between the two. And for survivors, it's not necessarily always that it's going to balance correctly. The thinking brain is going to tell the doing brain whether or not it's an actual threat. So when we talk about it, it's kind of always been shortened to the idea of fight, flight, or freeze. And that is a decent shorthand for it, even if it's not the in-depth brain chemistry, because repeated experiences of trauma can change your brain. When your body and stress is triggered constantly, it really does take a toll on your coping strategies. Often, domestic violence survivors are experiencing intense fear, helplessness, loss of control, and really worry for your life. And so traumatic events happen because this catastrophic thing is happening and your brain is overwhelmed. All the coping strategies that are in your thinking brain and are stashed away somewhere really aren't something you're able to access. Trauma impacts the central nervous system, which can have ripple effects on all kinds of parts of your body, the cardiovascular system, the endocrine system, and the digestive system. Has anyone ever had an upset stomach when they're feeling a little nervous? Trauma can really complicate the diagnosis, the treatment, and how to recover. So it becomes an incredible impact on your physical health as well as your mental health. Threats often seem bigger than they are because we recognize that there is long-term impacts, and that if you've been exposed to some of this really chaotic trauma, then your body can't perceive threats correctly. For example, an example one of my colleagues really likes to use is a smell. So if someone really associates the smell of lemon cleaner with a domestic violence incident, your brain might recognize that as a connection to trauma. And when you smell lemon cleaner, it's not really something where you're able to make a rational connection. It tells you that there is danger. Even if you rationally believe it's not, your body still thinks there is and keys itself up. Our filtering system doesn't work as well. So your brain can't recognize whether a space is safe or if a space is not safe. It just gets in threat mode. And we can't recognize ourselves, which I find is something that survivors really struggle with. The idea of I can't trust my own reaction. I can't trust my own judgment. I can't trust how I perceive a situation. And that becomes very frustrating for them. And there's the sense that there's someone with a hair trigger, someone who can be set off at any moment. That's because they cannot trust their response to things. And I think it's important to recognize that survivors perceive danger everywhere, even when there is not actual danger. But that is because their body is telling them that this is a dangerous situation. So your body and brain is stressed. Your memory may be disturbed. Your thoughts, your feelings, and your judgment may be affected. That's a lot. That is a lot. And someone who experienced trauma might be able to display none of these, might be displaying all of these. The exact factors are so individual. I wish I could give you a cardboard cutout of this is what a trauma survivor experiences. But the reality is that everyone is different in some combination of these. But what I think it's really important to say is that traumatic reactions are normal responses to abnormal situations. Constantly, survivors will say, are these feelings normal? And they are as normal as can be, where something abnormal and really awful happened to them. So I think it's important to recognize that that is exactly what your body is telling you to do, even if it's not the healthiest response over the long term. Okay, so that's a little bit about TV. And then, now that you know that, how do you support survivors who are being abused? I would imagine, and Alicia, maybe if people could put in the chat, there are probably a lot of situations in which all of you are going to need to talk to survivors about their abuse or what they've been experiencing. So does anyone have any suggestions for things that they find really useful, being comfortable with survivors, being helpful?
We did have a comment from Tarrant, and Tarrant, feel free to unmute if you would like to, or if not. But he said the sanctuary model is a great tool when dealing with trauma. If anyone's familiar with the sanctuary tool, or Tarrant, if you want to give us a little bit of information on what that model is. Okay, maybe not. But yeah, so Tarrant did say in the chat that the sanctuary model is a great tool. If anyone, we do have a couple of DV providers here on the training with us. So if you guys have any tools or anything that you use in your day-to-day work, we definitely want to use this space as an opportunity to share those.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what other people find this helpful.
Hi, this is Deidre from Chowbank.
Oh, that's cheating for Deirdre to answer the question. You're advanced.
Well, I thought I would. Terrence didn't jump on. I just wanted to talk about the sanctuary model. And I'm talking from the perspective of running the domestic violence shelters. One of the things that has been, well, it's the model has been a tremendous help in how our survivors experience shelter living. I've been doing this for a long time, and what we learned was in providing sheltering, that being very regimented was actually not in the best interest of our survivors in shelter. What actually was happening was a lot of rules and regulations that were shaped around in our thinking of helping the shelters run smoothly. But what we realized was through that type of kind of model that we were actually re-traumatizing our clients. And so we practice and People's Place, we all kind of walked into practicing the sanctuary model. I think they actually practiced it before us and does more of a practice it to the T of how it's presented. But it gives an opportunity for our survivors to have a voice. and what their experience is in the shelter. And what we found was that model actually was a stress reducer for our staff, who were prior to that, very consumed with, this 25-page book of rules that we had. So now we have a two-sided paper that is very, very general in our expectations of our clients. And a lot of that work is done via conversation versus, having something that's kind of in stone. And being able to offer flexibility is important, because often our survivors, you talked about, trauma, are of course, behaviors are, that's something that happens while you're in shelter naturally. And so having conversation and talking about their experiences and how to look at things differently, and coming up with some tools to help them has been really, really important. I know the coalition and many other not only DV providers, but lots of meetings I've been in, we start our meetings with a community meeting. And the community meeting is a concept that was based out of the sanctuary model. And the point of it is for us to not only to be able to check in with one another, to see where we are, to see if someone in this group needs some particular support, set up expectations early, and making sure that people get their needs met, during that time. And so when and it's something that a lot of people like, it's different, but it is important. And I would encourage folks on during this meeting in your own agencies to look into it and perhaps practice it, because I think that you'll find that it's a great tool, not only for your clients, but your staff.
Thank you. That was really helpful. Always a pleasure to have you with us, Deirdre. But yeah, we're going to be talking a lot about how do we speak to survivors about abuse. And one of the things, spoiler alert, is establishing that trust and connection, is being able to start with, how are you today? And it being okay if it's not really good, actually. I'm really struggling. I'm frustrated. I'm angry. Giving space to make it clear that this is a space where it's okay to feel your feelings is actually a lovely thing to be able to offer. Judith's right, not just for service users, but for staff. And I think I could do 2 hours about making sure that this gets rubbed in, but trust and connection is so important. It is so important that, let's be honest, you are going to be discussing something that is deeply difficult sometimes and very emotional with someone. It can be hard to be like, hello, nice to meet you, open up to me. And I find that without a good trust and connection, it's hard to get anywhere. Tony, I know you are off camera for a sec, but I wanted to ask if you had any tips from us as when you're meeting a new client, if there's anything you find is helpful to establish trust and connection.
No, sorry, I was muted there. I mean, I think
You're going to tell us you don't, but none of them trust you.
Yes, I don't have a ton of secrets to it. I think really it's just, I mean, for me, I think that it's been particularly difficult the most recent years is not being able to be in person, but really just showing that you're there listening, and so much of it, and particularly with being an attorney, so much of it just feels like, okay, well, this is what the law says, and this is the plan, and this is what we're going to do. So much of it is trying to remain conversational, remain and conversational in that you're there working with the person, not telling them what we're doing. And I think we'll come up with safety planning stuff, but a lot of it is to me is really just establishing that you're there to listen to be, you know, a resource for what people mean, you know, or for what a survivor needs, but not that you're, you know, the boss and you're going to tell them what to do. And that is, you know, and that's the way that it's going to be. I think really, you know, listening and, you know, trying to formulate the relationship as you know, a partnership and working together, you know, is kind of the way that I, you know, approach, you know, those initial meetings.
Felicia, do we have anyone in the chat who had any tips on it?
Yep, we do have some comments. So Andrea said, don't act like you know or empathize with their trauma. So I think that really speaks to number one, establish trust and connection. I think when coming into the situation, like we said, everyone's trauma is different, as well as how they cope with that trauma. So I think in a lot of instances, it's kind of counterproductive to come into the situation acting like you know exactly what they're going through, because everyone's situation is different. So thank you, Andrea. I really appreciate that comment. And then secondly, we have Ashley that said, try to use nonviolent communication skills, observe and understand their feelings and needs and requests.
Because all of these are great things. No, great work that you're doing. Always speak to couples individually. And I will tell you, it completely defeats the purpose if you walk up to them in front of their partner and say, oh, I need to speak to your partner now to screen them for abuse. When I was pregnant with my son, they would say that, my doctor, and it drove me absolutely crazy frustrated, because the reality is you cannot tell at a look who is suffering abuse and who is not. And when you joke about it, what you tell that person is this is not a safe person to disclose to. So be thoughtful about the fact that someone who is experiencing domestic violence isn't going to cop to it in front of their partner, and just add this in as your routine. You can't always tell. The best way is if you follow this and are empathetic and provide a safe space for everyone. Be thoughtful of safety dynamics. So that can include being aware that someone may have special needs as where to receive their mail, how they can talk to you on the phone. Don't leave voice messages. Be thoughtful. And when someone tells you something like, you absolutely cannot leave a voicemail for me, someone else checks it, respect that. Be aware, be thoughtful, and listen to what they tell you. And to be comfortable and direct discussing abuse. Now, this sounds sometimes, I think, like it could be counterintuitive of you want me to establish trust and connection. But I think, how do I explain this? That it's threading the needle a little bit. So you want to be compassionate, you want to be understanding, but I think a lot of times people will use euphemism. Does your partner abuse you is harder to misunderstand than, so does anyone hurt you? Making sure that you are being thoughtful. I will tell you an example of recently that I dealt with someone who wrote on an intake that my partner abuses me. And when you actually spoke to them, it turns out that they were repeatedly raped. So a lot of times within that language, there is a lot of information and specifics. Don't ask if you don't need the specifics, but recognize that sometimes when you do, and when you use euphemisms, that can make it harder to make sure that you are on the same page. I'm going to reiterate confidentiality because I think it is so essential. And I am actually going to let Tony handle this as the attorney as to why confidentiality is so important.
Hey, sorry about that. Yeah. So I mean, and speaking from, you know, and we'll get on to this, you know, portion of it as we, you know, get directly to the issues with housing. But when we, you know, when we're talking, at least, you know, with the safety to begin with, one of the, you know, components of the housing protections that are there for survivors is to, you know, if they are going to be moving out of a unit where, you know, abuse has occurred, or where their abuser knows that they live, where, you know, any type of conversation like that potentially, you know, risks giving up, a person's address is something that is immediately, going to put that, survivor at risk of, and potentially, yeah, just like, literally harm them. We, when, thinking about the idea of trust, that I mean, I think is also part of that initial conversation that needs to happen with any client survivor, of letting them know that they, can feel safe, that whatever, conversation comes between the two of, you, that you, are going to keep their confidences. And so that's, a really important component of the, trust building process. So as we're, going, like I said, going through the rest of the presentation, we'll see where, there's issues of where, where it's literally, it is a legal issue that you maintain someone's, confidentiality, but also, like with a lot of the funders that we particularly as, nonprofit organizations deal with, it's, there's a combination of issues where we have, some responsibility to, for related to reporting, but also need to make sure that, our organizations and that our work are, doing it in a way that is making sure that we're, putting the safety of the survivor first.
And I think it's really essential to mention that for survivors, disclosing is a risky thing. We all know that the most dangerous time for a survivor is after they leave, and when they've just left an abusive relationship. So telling someone and making themselves vulnerable, that is a really scary and we know risky thing for them to do. And so they have to measure that. They're seeking services to make themselves safe, but they also know it can be a risk. So remember that by keeping something confidential, you can make that less risky. There are repercussions for seeking services, particularly in Delaware, particularly here in Delaware, where we all know each other. Thank you to the person who I knew casually who complained about a horrible Tinder date with, turns out, my cousin. We all know each other, and everyone knows that if you say something negative about someone, the person you're talking to will be their sister or their mom or their cousin. So it's really important that we prevent that by maintaining confidentiality. Survivors who are told about confidentiality and know that they can respect it and what the boundaries are a lot more likely to feel comfortable confiding in you. All it takes is one person to violate their trust for them to feel like services aren't right for me, I'm not going to seek them. You can make a massive difference to whether or not the survivor feels like other services are safe and whether or not they feel like people are innately trustworthy.
Hey, Nick,
What
there's a
Yes,
question
Sarah.
in the chat. Can you talk about how shelters can deal with confidentiality in like a congregate slash shared living setting when it comes to survivors?
So it's going to make a bit of a difference. I would love for someone to, if someone wanted to come up mute and are saying, are you talking about intake or are you talking about having someone in a shelter and trying to adjust to their trauma and support them?
Hey, Nick, it was Rachel. It was me, Rachel, that asked the question. I was just kind of thinking about how if you're in a shelter environment that's specifically designed for people who are fleeing, there's an automatic assumption and obviously staff trained to know all the tricks of the trade around confidentiality and keeping things safe. And when I think about homeless assistance programs, it's because it's not like every client they serve. Sometimes there's a lack of practice or awareness. And I was just wondering if there were any specific strategies in that type of setting.
That is a great point, Rachel, particularly because we know in Delaware, the #1 population who is homeless is women with children. And we know that obviously a massive amount of them are going to be homeless as a result of domestic violence in one form or another. So a couple different ways that we can think about it. The first is obviously for intake. Make sure that it's confidential, make sure that that is not something where people can overhear. Make sure that that is something where you are not sharing that. But in a shelter setting, I think the important thing is communication with the survivor. Maybe sit down somewhere where other people, where you have some privacy, and talk about, this is a shared space. You flagged to me on your intake that there was an issue with domestic violence. What are you comfortable revealing? Here's what's happening in the shelter. How can we strategize together? And Tony made a great point. This is not me telling you how this is going to happen. Let's work together to develop your comfort level, what you're willing to disclose, what are your routines, and recognizing that this is something that you are supporting them with figuring out where their comfort level is. So I would certainly say the best tip I can give is make sure that you are doing confidential check-ins with someone to find out how you want to work together, and be honest with them about limitations. I realize that this is difficult for you. This is what we can and can't do. Because the one thing that is particularly hard for survivors is not understanding the boundaries and the balance and the ability to work within it. If you are clear, this is what we can and cannot do, and this is how we can adjust within that, there is a compassion and a kindness to that. Was that in any way helpful?
Yes, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so next to everyone's favorite topic, sure is mine, mandatory reporting. So there are a few instances where there is absolutely a need for a mandatory report. And if you look, it's going to be child. Child abuse reports should always be made when there is physical harm. So this is going to be a child is injured, a child is suspected to be injured since a weapon or a dangerous object has been used, or child has attempted to physically intervene. In all of these situations, a mandatory report should be made. Now, I am guessing that within shelters, you probably all have a practice of reporting to a supervisor and deciding with the supervisor when there should be a mandatory report. I hope that it's something that you have support in without breaking confidentiality. There should also be an abuse report when there's emotional harm. So they are there when a caregiver is being abused and it involves a significant injury. So this is not just if you believe that something may have happened. If you recognize that there was a serious incident, your thoughts should be, what is happening to the child? And if there's a weapon. We find a lot of times with gun violence, there is a mandatory report, which makes sense. And for more information, ISeeTheSigns.org. Also, DFS has some great resources on when a mandatory report is required under Delaware law. But what I will say is that there is no Delaware law that mandates reporting just because there was domestic violence. If all you know is from an adult that they experienced domestic violence, that is not a mandatory report. And be thoughtful about the fact that intimate partner violence being reported can be a safety issue. Unfortunately, sometimes a police officer may show up, and once the police officer leaves, the perpetrator will take it out on the survivor. And it might keep the survivor from, in future, seeking medical care, seeking dental care, seeking mental health care, saying, they're going to report me, why would I go? So recognize that safety planning is something that we are going to discuss a little bit, but that there is a lot of intense decision making made in keeping someone safe that has to do with reporting. So if someone discloses to you, make sure that your response is survivor-centered. As Tony said, this is what I'm going to do. This is what are we going to discuss together? How can we support each other? How can we make this decision with me providing you resources for you to make the decision? Keep the disclosure as minimal as possible. You do not need intense details of every time an abuse occurred, intimate details. It is enough to know what you need to know for the situation you're in. Is there an ongoing safety risk? Who is the person? So think about what you need to know and what you don't need to know. And get permission to share info with others. If you are speaking to someone else in your office, I find a lot of times I get calls that need to be shared with Tony as an attorney or with someone else in my office. And I will say, is it okay if I explain the situation to my colleague? Would you prefer to call them yourself? What would make you comfortable? So just recognize that for someone who has very little control, actually having the information and controlling their own information is so essential. Particularly, written permission can be really useful. Sometimes all you can do is verbal permission, but I am very skeptical that you should ever disclose without the okay from a survivor, except for the mandatory reporting. Are there any questions about that? I know that's a bit of a tricky topic. What is it? Count to 8 and then move on? All right. I am going to turn it over to Tony for everyone's favorite part of this, federal housing protections.
Thank you, Nick. So yeah, I guess the next few slides we'll kind of just walk through both the federal housing protections that exist and a couple of the laws that are relevant, and then yeah, just continue through the different housing protections that exist for survivors. So you'll see next slide here, we're going to talk about the Fair Housing Act to start. So if you looked at the actual text of the Fair Housing Act, you're not going to find the words, domestic violence or survivor. It's the way that we work these protections into the act is, due to the fact that the, extremely, or the large majority of survivors of domestic violence are women. The act is read to include protections based on the law, prohibiting discrimination based on sex. So that's how we, are able to work these different protections and the different protections of the Fair Housing Act to make sure that they apply to survivors. So in, kind of the broad brush general, idea of the Fair Housing Act is that it, serves as a protection for domestic violence survivors and really any one, based the variety of different protections based on gender or race. And it's a protection to ensure that housing providers, whether they're private housing providers or subsidized housing by the government, making sure that those whether tenants or homeowners are protected against discrimination. So you'll see a couple of the key components here of the Fair Housing Act. Anti-discrimination. So when we talk about the anti-discrimination components of the Fair Housing Act, think of one example being, and please feel free to add in the chat other examples that you may have seen with clients that you've worked with. But one example of anti-discrimination is you work for a domestic violence agency and are helping one of your clients find housing, and you call a landlord and you begin that process. And then they see, the landlord or prospective housing provider sees that, you're working for a domestic violence agency, and they say, like, I don't want to, rent or sell, my unit or my property to, someone, to a domestic violence survivor. I don't want to get involved in that. That would be, kind of one form of discrimination that a, survivor could encounter. The next component is protection for evictions. In a combination of the different laws that we're going to be discussing today, it should be very difficult. And again, there's the unfortunate reality is a lot of the times our clients and survivors will fall through the cracks. But if the law was working perfectly, survivors would not be evicted based on their status as survivors of domestic violence. The equal protection component that you'll see here, that is just that component of the Fair Housing Act makes sure that all tenants are treated the same. So if you have a housing provider who decides, well, I'm going to rent to you, survivor. However, because of the potential that violence could happen in this household, I'm going to charge you a higher security deposit than the other tenant here. That is a major violation of equal protection, and the idea that all tenants need to be treated equally. And then the final component we'll see here is relates to reasonable accommodations. So as we discussed earlier with our conversation about trauma and what domestic violence and how it can impact individuals. One of the bigger examples that we'll see is a survivor who has a emotional support animal. That if you're at a property that strictly says no pets or no animals, the Fair Housing Act requires property owners, landlords to accommodate, to grant a reasonable accommodation, and essentially change the rules that exist for other tenants to make sure that an individual who needs an emotional support animal, or based on their disability, that they're able to get around whatever lease provision that would prevent them from having an animal at the property.
This is my favorite piece of legislation. VAWA.
Yes, so VAWA, the one that I'm sure we're all very familiar with. So VAWA is, it provides housing protections generally, and really works hand in hand with the Fair Housing Act, but provides housing protections for survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking, who are seeking to live in federally assisted housing. So the law applies to survivors regardless of sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, or age. And again, to be clear, is this is the VAWA offers protections for individuals who are living in or seeking to live in federally subsidized housing. So what does VAWA do? Requires that there is a notice that is provided to tenants who are survivors, laying out clearly what their rights are as survivors, or if they were to become, or if they face any issues with domestic violence, what their options are to get assistance from their housing provider. I see the question there. So yes, the VAWA would apply in domestic violence situations. So the protections here, and again, a lot of this goes hand in hand with the Fair Housing Act, but survivors can't be denied access to services or again be evicted based on the violence that is committed against them. One of the kind of key components, and an issue that we'll see a lot, is when when there is domestic violence in a home, the landlord will say, okay, well, I'm evicting everybody. With VAWA, what will happen is a survivor can request that the abuser, essentially that the lease is, split, so that the landlord can move forward with evicting the abuser while allowing the survivor to, stay in the unit and maintain their tenancy with the unit. There's also the option where domestic violence exists in the home, where a tenant can request to move to another unit. And here, again, and this kind of plays into the line of privacy and things like that. Or why privacy is so important is because the landlords can often or will, have it be required to help, facilitate the move for the tenant. So they would, move to another location, hopefully that, and, have the, hopefully while doing so without the abuser, getting that information of where they're moving to. One I guess, and the other, really key component to this is the documentation can be significantly, easier than, we don't need a police report. There is a pretty straightforward HUD form that can be used where a survivor is able to self-certify, as a survivor. So I don't know if we have the copy with the presentation, but it's very, essentially all you'd need, if you just Google, HUD domestic violence form, you'll get a self-certification form that a survivor can complete and provide to their landlord. And that kind of begins the process of really, working with the survivor to determine what is best for, what their needs are. This is, kind of where, as advocates or as, an attorney, this is where we begin the process of really, talking through the survivor with what their options are and making sure that we're, whether it's, needing assistance with getting the abuser out of the home, or if it's just knowing that they need to move to a new unit. That's, again, those are, it's important that we're really working with the survivor and ensuring that they, that VAWA provides a lot of options to protect their housing, and making sure that those options are communicated to the survivor, and they're, we're able to help them make the, make the choice that they feel most comfortable with and that will be most helpful for them.
And I'll just reiterate that, they do not have to report to the police in order for VAWA to apply. There does not need to be a police report. Okay, Americans with Disabilities Act.
Yep. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, or we'll hear the shorthand of ADA. This is the law that is going to be most relevant and important for survivors who have a disability, and that that obviously includes a disability that comes as a result of the domestic or sexual violence that they've experienced. I think they had mentioned this earlier, but women with disabilities disproportionately experience domestic violence. So when we're talking about the ADA, it's really, or when we're talking about options, whether it's under the Fair Housing Act or VAWA, it's really important to understand that there's even more protection that can be available for survivors who have disabilities. And just to, and before I guess moving on to 504, I think what I'll add is really one of the main components that we see a lot of the time is emotional support animals, but it can be broader than that. In the way kind of that I've always thought about the Americans with Disabilities Act, whenever there's no law against asking for an accommodation. So I've had instances where a survivor who had extreme anxiety and PTSD, who was living in a unit where her upstairs neighbor had kids, and just it was just very loud upstairs at all hours of the night, and just the complaints about noise just weren't getting the job done to help address her issues with PTSD and anxiety. So we were able to work with the landlord to have her move to another unit that we suspected would be quieter than below a large family. So those are kind of the examples where if there's if you can make a reasonable connection between what the request is and what the and with the disability and how that impacts a survivor's day-to-day living, there's no harm in asking for that accommodation to be made. And it often really kind of a key component of it is it really starts kind of the negotiating with the landlord to come up with something, with everyone together to come up with something that is going to accommodate, the survivor. And the last federal component or federal law that we'll talk to really, again, ties hand in hand with the ADA. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act requires survivors with disabilities to have reasonable accommodations made for them. So like I said, the examples being, service animals or moving to a quieter unit. These are, all pretty, or relatively common accommodations that can be made for survivors. And, other note that is important is like VAWA section 504 requires confidentiality So again, the idea of confidentiality really comes in as both a just kind of trust building exercise with our clients, but also the legal requirements that exist to keep their information confidential. So the state housing protections that exist, we'll just run through those relatively quickly. We talk about our one issue that can come up is if a survivor needs to terminate a lease early. So we've had instances where a survivor or where a survivor knew that their abuser was leaving the prison system soon and needed to find a confidential unit and needed to leave, and were able to terminate their lease early such that they were able to vacate the unit before their abuser was able came home and knew where they were living. We also have different eviction protections that exist, and again, this really ties straight up with the Fair Housing Act and with VAWA, and making sure that survivors are not being evicted due to their status as a survivor. Most recently, and this was a more pretty there's definitely a more complicated situation than kind of some of the examples I've given already, but this will hopefully kind of demonstrate how much Fair Housing Act and VAWA can kind of be stretched to serve survivors. We had a case where a survivor came to CLASI, and as a she was just living in a situation where her abuser husband was was just completely in control of the family's finances, and he had fallen behind on rent, was not paying anything. And I guess, part of the pattern of economic control that he exhibited is that, he was the only person on the lease. And so this was a family with 3 children and the survivor, and they were just completely left off the lease despite living there for nearly 5 years. So we were able to work with the landlord and after an arrest, and where the abuser was no longer at the property, and of course not paying rent any longer, we were able to work with the landlord to make sure that the survivor was included onto the lease, and essentially took over for the abuser. And then finally, the address confidentiality program. Again, this is in place to ensure that survivors who where their safety comes down to making sure that their address is confidential, are protected, and that they that their abuser does not have access to where they're currently living. Does anyone, and so what we'll kind of wrap up at least with this portion of it is we'll talk through if whether if anyone has any stories that they'd like to share, either whether it's related to the address confidentiality program or any other eviction related story that one of your clients may have experienced. And feel free, of course, to drop anything in the chat or any questions or stories that you might have experienced.
We'll give you a minute or two.
Hi, my name is Latasha Newton. I run a housing program. So in the situation and scenarios that you use, I can see I agree with a lot of what you said, but in these situations, it is individual occupancy, but they share a unit. So with a particular case of a female that is being abused by her boyfriend or her significant other, and her roommates are being traumatized, how would that work if the only bottom line is to discharge her because now others' safety has been jeopardized? So how would you handle that situation?
No, that's a really tough question, and yeah, it's obviously a difficult situation. See, and the way, particularly when CLASI deals with kind of whether it's roommate, people living together or neighbor disputes, it would be, as just kind of a general policy, we are, when it comes down to like evicting others, unless it's in that very specific context of the abuser is, living in the unit, we, won't get involved with instances where we're, that would lead to someone's, eviction essentially, which is kind of, to me, it sounds like there's, yeah, the conflicting issue of, what do we do when the, neighbors are, or when the other folks are experiencing the issue. So that is a really tough one. And I don't really have a straight answer for you besides, it's, worth reaching out to an agency or to CLASI to kind of talk through what options could be. But yeah, there just really isn't a straight issue when there's kind of the confliction of what do we do, how do we serve the survivor while also, serving the other folks that it, the abuse is impacting.
And hopefully some of the resources we've shared can be helpful about having a discussion with the survivor, about being able to connect them with resources, about being able to discuss to them, and even being able to be honest and say that we're thoughtful about everyone's safety, about your roommates, and kind of making this something that you work through together is always my suggestion for it, for sure.
Yeah, no, what we did was just really eliminated the concern from the roommate perspective, because we didn't want them to feel like they were complaining and that was the reason that we knew. So the bottom line was the individual significant other was very aggressive. Even it kind of came towards us as well. So we offered all of the possible options of whether domestic violence counselor, therapy, and everything, but it all was just, she was not receptive to nothing because all she wanted to do was be with him. So a lot of the information we shared today was good, and I will share it. So thank you.
No, thank you. Yeah, no, it's difficult. You're trying to be thoughtful for everyone involved, aren't you? Thank you for sharing. That was really appreciated. I'm looking to see if we have anything. Oh, Ashley, thank you for disclosing. Ashley noted that when she went through her experience in Maryland and when she went back to Delaware, her address was kept confidential. I'm so glad that that worked for you, that the system did what it was supposed to do. It's good to hear. Did anyone else have any questions in this section? We will give more time for Q&A at the end. I think we're moving nicely, so there will be time at the end for sure. Okay. Well, then I am going to go to my favorite part, which is now that I've left you feeling deeply depressed and upset about the state of domestic violence in Delaware, how can you fix it? Delaware has three, if you count the Spanish language, 24-hour hotlines. And those hotlines are catch-all situations. They can connect people to emergency shelter, to counseling, to safety planning. And those hotlines are also there for you. If you are someone who is working with people about domestic violence and feeling like, you know what, this is a really hard thing to deal with, I would like to speak to someone who understands how difficult it is to support someone in domestic violence, that number is for you. All the advocates are trained with an understanding not only of trauma, but also your vicarious trauma. And so I would really recommend that these are a great resource for you to have, for you to share, and for you to hold on to. So in Delaware, statewide, over 3,000 calls are made to the hotline in a year. Yeah. And when you think about the population in Delaware, that's a lot. 2 shelters in Newcastle County, and then 3 in Kent and Sussex. So not a lot compared to those 3,000 calls, but doing great work for sure. So the DV shelters are in confidential locations. There's 24/7 support on site. And they look like normal family houses, but they are DV shelters. And they can also help provide shelter and other space if space is unavailable. So that is something where call the hotline and they can give you more details as to how they can support with housing. So what services are in shelter? Safety planning. I cannot emphasize this enough. If you come with one thing, well, Tony will say knowing the law, but I will say if you come away with one thing, it's knowing how essential it is to safety plan. Domestic violence advocates extend extensive training on safety planning. I would say anyone who is experiencing domestic violence, call the hotline and they can help you strategize, safety plan, so essential, and learning on how to keep yourself safe, even if they're not willing to exit a relationship. Goal setting. So for some people, it's I can't leave now, but I can leave 6 months down the road where I've put together some money. How can I keep myself safe in the meantime? And how can I work towards that goal? Resource identification, recognizing who they can access. What is the support? A lot of times I will get a call from an advocate that says, who's that lawyer who spoke at the thing? He's good. He takes domestic violence cases. And then I give them Tony's number to spam. So advocates are always able to help with that. Connection to other services. Yep. Legal, housing, social services. Advocates are miracle workers. They really are. And some of these are not just available to people in shelter, but to anyone. Safety planning is something that is really helpful to anyone. So again, community services, the 24-hour hotlines, the shelter services, support with protection from abuse orders. So I want to be thoughtful about what I'm telling you about protection from abuse orders, because we sometimes have people who will just send a survivor to get a protection from abuse order. And the reality is that the domestic violence advocacy program is so helpful if you are planning a protection from abuse order. It can be a very complicated process. So what I would recommend is if you are telling someone about protection from abuse orders, tell them about the domestic violence advocacy program. Tell them that there are advocates who are going to support them with the family court system, and that they are within the courthouse and they are really helpful in accessing the PFA. As I said, they navigate the family court system. I would never send someone just alone into court themselves. I would remind them that DVAP makes a big difference. And they are in all 3 county courthouses. So if you are dealing with someone in Georgetown, in Dover, or in Wilmington, there's someone in all of those places that can help them. Financial literacy. We do this as well as People's Place. Does education about managing finances, budgeting, credit, etc. We know economic abuse is something that almost 90% of survivors experience. So it is so incredibly important that we allow survivors space to learn about financial literacy and learn about managing their own budget and credit. Savings tools, microloans, match savings, all the fun stuff that your employer talks about, all of those we provide education to. Family visitation centers. So these are really helpful for families who have experienced a history of domestic violence. And so a lot of times we find that when domestic violence has occurred, it still occurs in the idea of power control after separation and through families. So these visitation centers allow for supervised visitations, allow for a safe space to exchange children if there is shared custody. And it's just a safe and neutral environment where parents can access or visit their children. They can have visits on site. They can have monitored visits on site, and they can exchange for off-site visits. So this is really useful for families that want to maintain that relationship, even if they're still working on how to develop a stronger visitation process. And finally, legal assistance. Tony, you want to say anything about CLASI? I was like, I could, but you know, it's your home, so maybe you should.
might be better coming from, you know, a neutral source. But yeah, so at Legal Aid, we, and also Delaware Volunteer Legal Services, I think will be coming up as well. But we're the two.
Spoiler.
Yes, but we're the two legal aid organization, or two of the three legal aid organizations that, you know, are probably, that will assist with PFAs and other, you know, legal issues that are going to come up that, you know, survivors experience. What I will say is, yeah, I mean, again, I'm not in our domestic violence unit, but the work I do with housing, we, you know, collaborate with the family law office, you know, quite frequently. So if you're, you know, a survivor, you send a survivor our way who is experiencing, you know, housing issues, but also needs help with a PFA, things like we, you know, our office collaborates together to make sure that those, you know, issues are all being addressed together. And then you also see the other thing, obviously we are free, which is an important thing, I think, for survivors to know. But also you'll see the Delaware Legal Help link, which includes, you know, if there is, you know, other legal issues that, you know, we can't provide assistance with, like divorce or things like that. There's that legal help link is going to be, you know, essential to help find, you know, other attorneys that are available to help, you know, with the issues that we, you know, don't cover.
And I will say, even if it's an issue that you don't think CLASI covers or DVLS, I find them really helpful for being like, no, we don't do that, but here's who does. So they're always a great source of referral. Again, Delaware, everyone knows everyone, which really helps. And then I want to make sure I flag the system-based resource. Delaware is unusual in that we have a very, very strong within the government structure, the advocacy. So that's police-based victim services. So there are victim services in Newcastle County, Wilmington Police, Delaware State Police, Department of Corrections. All of these have victim service specialists. Some of the smaller police forces downstate, I believe, don't, but in that case, they will pull in a Delaware State Police specialist. So anyone who is working with the police really has access to these victim services, which are great works. And they can really help serve as a liaison between the survivor and detectives, police officers, prosecutors, probation officers. So if someone mentions that they're working with the police or Department of Corrections, you can always flag, have you been able to access a social worker? Okay, moving. Domestic violence services and resources. So we mentioned the 24-hour hotline, the shelter services, the community case management services, PFA support, counseling in groups, financial literacy, advocacy, family visitation centers, legal assistance, offender treatment, law enforcement, and crime victim services. So there is never a situation where you are on your own. These groups are a community that are here to work with you in making sure that we work together to support a survivor. And as for national resources, I will just flag this because sometimes you might get a call from someone in Pennsylvania or New Jersey. This National Domestic Violence Hotline will refer anyone to their most local support services. So if someone's calling from out of state, it's a great one to pass on. And for national teen dating violence, this is a great helpline. They do the texting and the chatting. I don't think they do the TikTok, but I understand that kids these days are very into like the texting and they're up on it. I don't have to be because they are. And I will send around these hotlines, but I have them all saved in my phone. Granted, I do a lot of work with domestic violence survivors. Really, really helpful and supportive. So I also added the sexual assault line, which if someone is sexually assaulted by someone who isn't an intimate partner, the sexual assault line is great. It's also a great hotline to for someone who wants to talk and just really needs the talk support. That's a great one as well. Okay, and I will say these are our email addresses. I'm not, Tony, I got you're okay to share your email address, right? And so if you are having issues, So much of what I get is someone who says, I know, Nick, you're not the right person, but I'm pretty sure you can connect me with the right person. So if you're not sure what is the right resource, if you have a problem, if you just need to pick a brain, that is what I'm here for. I think probably quite often I send Tony an email being like, there's a legal issue. Do you do it? And he will at least get back to me and say no. But yeah, all of this we do. We're always willing to support you. I am so enthusiastic that everyone here is dedicated to providing better services for survivors, and we want to help you to do that. And I wanted to make sure we left time at the end for questions and answers.
Nick, I had a question. So a lot of times, or in my experience, sometimes victims of domestic violence are can sometimes be in denial or like don't really want to open up or admit that they are victims of abuse. And in situations like that, do you have any strategies for like navigating those conversations or trying to assist people in that situation who might not be ready to quite admit to themselves about the abuse that they're experiencing?
So obviously there is a spectrum. There's everything from, I know my partner is abusive and I'm not ready to leave, to everything is fine and everything is great at all times. I am in the only perfect relationship that has ever existed. And your response is going to probably be varying based on where it is on that spectrum. So sometimes the survivor will say to me, I'm not sure I'd say it's abusive, but I would say sometimes he gets very angry, and I don't know how to handle that. And I think recognizing that resources are not only for someone who says, I want to leave this abusive relationship, but also someone who says, sometimes they're angry and I want support for those times. Safety planning is a great resource for someone who is not ready to leave, just not as ready. Because sometimes it'll involve tactics like, okay, well, once a month, you need to have a friend who you can stay with. Is there a place that you can keep yourself safe? Because I think ultimately it's recognizing that survivors are the best people who are aware of their own needs. Sometimes a survivor can't admit them to themselves, because if they did, it would lead to a chain that isn't as safe for them to go down. They're almost protecting themselves by having that mindset. So talking to them about using the language. So if someone describes it as they get angry, I wouldn't necessarily say, no, that's domestic violence, but always working towards safety planning and looking at where they are at the moment. I know that's a little vague, but hopefully that's somewhat helpful.
And that was definitely helpful. Thank you.
Do we have other questions? I know we're a little early, so.
And just a reminder for everyone, the slides will be provided after the training. They'll be sent out via email.
And I will also, I'm working on the afterwards. So I will have as I said, Tony doesn't need feedback. Tony's perfect. I would love your feedback. And if you give me the feedback, I will send you a certificate of attendance. They nodded a lot with Tony's perfect, which.
I am I'm not going to deny that.
But yes, I'm really appreciative that all of you are so interested. Clearly, you are dedicated at doing better for survivors, which is really, really amazing. No other questions? This is your one chance to ask a stupid question, and that's not true. You'll have plenty of other, but this is the one chance where I will, no one will ever say, you should have known that.
Well, Nick, this might be situational. But in the past, we've had a housing provider, a rapid rehouser contact us and let us know that a landlord that they're working with did not want to include the DV protections within the lease for the apartment that they were trying to get for their client. And would you have any, or you or Tony have any thoughts or recommendations about how to engage with landlords in that situation?
Tony, I think that's a you.
Oof, yeah, I mean, I would just send them to send me an email about that. Like, I don't, Aaron, are they, or I guess in communication, are they like saying why about anything, or is it just, we just don't want to do this?
I don't have those particular details,
Yeah.
but I can definitely have them follow up with you and let them know that they can use you as a resource when stuff like that comes about.
Yeah, no,
So Tony,
that's
what
definitely.
protections do private landlords have to include?
I'm sorry, say that again, Nick.
Which are the ones that private landlords have to include?
That the Fair Housing Act is going to apply to private landlords, or there's like some limit there's some exclusions, but yeah, they're generally not going to apply here. Yeah, I would say, yeah, Aaron, send that our way, because without it, just it's like, I don't know if the like just sending like an angry email is going to help, if that's something that could, if someone is like sending that might, just kind of end the communication there. But if there's if we get more information about why exactly they're not wanting to include that, I think that could potentially raise some of the, fair housing red flags of, why are they not doing this? I think there's, some questions there that are definitely a, concern.
Awesome, thank you.
Moral of the story, just send it to Tony. Just send it to Tony.
Yes.
All right, anyone else? All right, then. Thank you everyone for coming. I'll stay on for a little bit longer in case anyone wants to ask a question while everyone is trickling off. But thank you so much. We appreciate it, didn't we, Tony?
Thanks, everyone.
Is it Nick? Thank you for the training. It was really good.
Oh,
Very
thank you.
informative. Is it Nick?
It is.
Oh, yes. Quick question. So I don't know if anyone saw, I kind of was in and out. Sorry, I'm so busy. I'm extremely busy. I'm trying to work and train at the same time. But I had a situation with a young lady that had got assaulted by her neighbor. And the issue is, it's not domestic violence. Like, they don't live together. They don't go together. Pretty much the dog pooped on one side. She picks it up, put it on his side. He punches her. She goes ballistic, I guess you can say, after being pushed and punched in the face. And she gets arrested along with her girlfriend because he is considered over 62. And he's now stating that they attacked him when in fact the whole event took place on her property, meaning he came to her property. The VAWA, that was only for like domesticated stuff, like if they're dating, or I heard you say stalking, doesn't necessarily mean that they're together, but since this situation is not about stalking or anything like that, does that cover the female neighbor? Because to me, violence against women is something that has always happened. It's always been brushed under the rug. I heard some people telling their testimonies earlier. My mom was abused. I seen the abuse. I ain't gonna tell you what we tried to do, but
Oh, I'm sorry.
My mom got 5 kids and 4 of us, 3 of us was big. So we tried to take matters into our own hand, like, but that was a bad idea.
Yeah.
And because we really could have got hurt ourselves, you know what I'm saying? And we could have gotten more trouble. Like, what are those? I'm just going to use the word, it could have just got bad. And so in this case, I'm just really trying to give the lady some information or like a support group that she can go to, because she's actually traumatized by her neighbor, assaulting her. And she got arrested because it's like he hit her and then she went to go get protection and she came back and it appears that she tried to retaliate. And maybe she did. I mean, shoot, if somebody tried to hit me, would I try to retaliate? We can all say what we would do now, but until you're in that situation, you don't know what you'll do, And I just wanted to get some information to pass on to her or anything. Because right now she's feeling like technically she is the victim, but because of what she did after she was hit, she didn't harm him, she didn't touch him, she didn't do anything. Actually, her girlfriend sprayed him with mace. That's what happened. And he lied and said he only hit her because they attacked him with the mace. And that's when, he retaliated, which makes me think that he should have got arrested too then, because you should have went home. Like they told her, she should have went home. Did y'all have any for the neighbor?
Yeah, trying to think. You know what? Can you send me an email and I can connect you with the crime victims task force, because they do broader than just domestic violence and they might be really helpful with some resources.
Because to me, this is like some bully type of man is what I'm feeling. That bully, and then, oh, I'm over 62, they attacked me. It's like he turned it around, but the chain of events doesn't really add up to why would they just attack you? What was your email?
Yeah, I'll put in the chat. It's nbeard@dcadv.org.
Nbeard, who to what? Oh, you said it's in the chat?
Yeah,
okay,
in the chat.
Great. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. No, thanks for coming.
Yeah, and I'm sorry I was late and in and out, but
we get it. No, we get it. Don't like if I didn't tell Tony, he would
I literally have about 4 clients that came in on Friday, and I gotta, get with them, and my supervisor's like, did you? So, but this was awesome. I would like, I'm gonna send you an email. I'm with Veterans Multi-Service Center. I would really like for you guys to maybe do something specific for our ladies. We have a women's center.
Yeah.
And I think this might be perfect,
We would love that. I say for me and Tony.
You say what?
I'm like, we would love that. No, we love doing these trainings. So yeah, please.
Yeah, I will definitely be sending you another email. Everyone, please have a great week, but I gotta go.
Yeah, no, of course.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Nikki, I have a question. It's Bernita from Housing Alliance, Delaware.
Hey, Bernita.
Hello. I still work with individuals that call in regards to, of course, DV, and we give them the DV hotline. They tell us that they've already spoken to someone, that there's no space available. Is there a way that we're able to, I want to say, coordinate with case managers? For instance, my last call that kind of worried me was I got a call from a lady from Virginia. There wasn't no space available in Virginia. She was trying to make it from state to state to get here. She said she had spoken to someone, the DV hotline, because of course I offered to give her the number. We didn't have anything open as just shelters. Do you have any suggestions with that?
it's so hard because you're right, we prioritize Delaware residents. So if someone's coming from Virginia, it can be really hard to get a space. Brittany, what I will say is if you have my email and you ever want to like talk strategy about a particular person and see what we can do, please, please just pop me an email and you and I can chat it out on the phone and figure out what we can do to strategize. But it is hard because they're just like, I hate to say this, there just aren't enough spaces.
Okay, that sounds good. I worked with a lady a couple of years ago to get her here from Ohio. And from what I understand, she's doing well. But of course, that was just me working with a couple of people who are no longer actually working at the shelters now. And it just happened to be an opening somewhere that opened up, you know, kind of by the end of the day. So of course, my supervisor at that time told me to give that person a call and see if I can get that person near. But just like I said, there is no, once we say, okay, we don't have no opening, DV, you know, they say they spoke to DV, there wasn't nothing that could be done. That part where we're breaking, where we don't want to break confidentiality, call the next person, like there could be something at people's place, but then I'm like, okay, well, we did have a way that we would send the person's initials and say, well, we gave them your phone number. But now it's just kind of, when they're coming from another state, they're not guaranteed to make that call as soon as they hang up with me.
It's so, and you're
okay,
right.
That sounds really good, Miss Nikki. I will definitely
yeah, please do. Please do. We can always chat it through.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sherelle. I'm also from Housing Alliance. I'm glad Miss Bernita actually had brought up the client that she just talked about from Virginia. My most recent encounter with the DV young lady just had a lot of responsibility on her. I'm gonna send you an email as well. Had guardianship of her 14-year-old brother, had her own 9-month-old baby, and was also caring for her 98-year-old great-grandmother. And her daughter's father shot the 14-year-old son in the leg. And they were able to connect with the resource here that could get them into a motel just temporarily. But just with all of the other dynamics of their household with the 98-year-old grandmother, going into shelter, the brother also had autism. It was just a lot, but just like Ms. Bernita said, just not having a resource available or limited knowledge on, you know, the next step for this particular family. So if I could send you an email too.
Yeah, no,
if I could pick your brain,
sometimes it's just a little bit like, it's a puzzle piece. It's like saying,
yes,
will that work? Let's try it, you know, and so that's why I can't be like, this is the one thing every time. But like I said, I want to be a resource to you. Always happy to help strategize and figure out what we can do.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you. All right, anyone else waiting to? All right, Felicia, Erin, is there anything else you need from myself and Tony?
I don't think so. So I will be sending out the recording as well as the slides to all of the registrants. I saw that you had like some kind of assessment. Did you want me to send that out?
Yeah, is it okay if I just send that to you?
Absolutely. Yep. Yes, no problem.
Awesome. And I just wanted to thank both of you for taking the time to provide the training to everybody. It looks like we had a lot of really good feedback in the comments, and it was really useful for us as well. So thank you guys for taking the time for that.
Is this going to be an annual thing? Is this going to be like our March is going to be the DV training?
We would love that.
We would love it. Yes.
Yeah, let's do it. Tony,
Awesome.
I've signed you up.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Nick just loves signing me up for stuff.
Well, I'll vote for it, yes.
Oh, well, thank you. See, it's what the public wants, Tony. It's what the public wants. Thank you.
The
for
dream
this.
team over there.
All right. Talk to you all soon.
All right,
Thank you,
thank
guys.
you.
Thanks, Felicia. Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks, Tony.